Canada's landmass spans boreal forests, tundra, grasslands, mountain ranges, and 3 ocean coasts. This environmental diversity created distinct challenges and opportunities for prehistoric populations. The archaeological record remains incomplete due to glaciation, acidic soils, sea level change, and the vast scale of the territory. Evidence suggests human occupation extends back at least 13,000 years, though earlier presence is debated. Preservation varies dramatically between regions. Coastal sites are often submerged. Interior sites are scattered across millions of square kilometers. The material remains reflect adaptation to cold climates, seasonal mobility, and resource variability. Human presence in Canada during the terminal Pleistocene remains contested. Archaeologists debate whether people arrived before the Clovis culture, which appears in the archaeological record around 13,000 years ago. Ice sheets covered much of the landmass until approximately 15,000 years ago. 2 primary migration routes are proposed. The first is a coastal route along the Pacific shore, where people may have traveled by watercraft as ice retreated. The second is an interior corridor that opened between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets. Evidence for pre-Clovis occupation is sparse and debated. A small number of sites have produced contested dates that predate Clovis. These include claims from the Bluefish Caves in Yukon, where bone modifications have been interpreted as human activity dating to 24,000 years ago. Other researchers argue the modifications are natural or result from carnivore activity. The debate remains unresolved. Clovis-style fluted projectile points have been found in several Canadian provinces, though in far smaller numbers than in the continental United States. Alberta has yielded multiple Clovis points, particularly in the southern grasslands. British Columbia has produced a handful of finds. Ontario and Nova Scotia have also reported isolated examples. The distribution suggests small mobile populations moving across open landscapes. These groups likely hunted large mammals, including extinct species such as mammoths and mastodons, though direct kill sites are extremely rare in Canada. The Wally's Beach site in Alberta preserves tracks of both humans and megafauna, providing indirect evidence of interaction. Following the Clovis period, a variety of fluted point traditions appear across different regions. In the eastern provinces, fluted points resembling the Gainey and Barnes types are found. These are associated with caribou hunting in periglacial environments. In the west, stemmed point traditions emerge alongside fluted forms. The exact relationship between these traditions is unclear. Some archaeologists suggest continuity from Clovis. Others propose separate migrations or independent invention. The archaeological record does not resolve these questions definitively. Site preservation from this early period is poor. Organic materials rarely survive in acidic soils common across much of Canada. Stone tools dominate the assemblages. Hearths and lithic scatters provide limited information about camp organization. Faunal remains are scarce. This makes subsistence reconstruction difficult. Researchers rely on site location, tool types, and regional ecology to infer behavior. Kill sites are almost entirely absent. This contrasts with the plains of the United States, where numerous mammoth and bison kills have been excavated. The Debert site in Nova Scotia represents one of the best documented early sites. It dates to approximately 10,600 years ago. Excavations revealed concentrations of fluted points, scrapers, and other stone tools. The site is interpreted as a caribou hunting camp. No faunal remains survived, but the artifact distribution and location suggest repeated seasonal occupation. Similar sites exist in other provinces, but most are surface finds or small excavations with limited contextual data. In the Arctic and subarctic regions, evidence of early human occupation is extremely limited. The harsh environment and extensive ice cover delayed colonization. The earliest sites in the Northwest Territories and Nunavut date to the early Holocene, after 10,000 years ago. These sites are associated with small mobile groups exploiting caribou and other terrestrial mammals. Coastal resources were not yet a significant component of subsistence in these northern areas during the terminal Pleistocene. British Columbia's early record is complicated by coastal submergence. Sea levels were lower during the late Pleistocene, and many early coastal sites are now underwater. Excavations on Haida Gwaii and along the mainland coast have recovered early Holocene materials, but terminal Pleistocene sites remain elusive. The few inland sites suggest human presence by at least 11,000 years ago. These sites contain leaf-shaped points and microblade technology, distinct from Clovis traditions. The relationship between coastal and interior populations is debated. The Great Lakes region was covered by ice until approximately 13,000 years ago. As the ice retreated, proglacial lakes formed and shifted. Early sites cluster near these ancient shorelines. The Shegianda site on Manitoulin Island has produced controversial evidence of human activity, with some researchers claiming extremely old dates. Most archaeologists reject these claims, placing the earliest reliable occupation in the early Holocene. The region's early record is characterized by fluted points and a focus on caribou hunting. Population size during this early period was likely very small. Estimates are speculative, but researchers suggest a few thousand individuals across the entire Canadian landmass. Mobility was high. Groups moved seasonally to exploit scattered resources. Settlement patterns were flexible and opportunistic. There is no evidence of permanent structures or long-term occupation at any single location. Camps were temporary, occupied for days or weeks before groups moved on. The end of the Pleistocene brought significant environmental change. Megafauna began to disappear from the landscape. Mammoths, mastodons, and other large species went extinct by approximately 10,000 years ago. The causes are debated. Climate change, human hunting, and disease have all been proposed. The impact on human populations is unclear. Some researchers argue that megafauna extinction forced subsistence shifts. Others suggest that large mammals were never a primary food source and that their disappearance had minimal effect. The archaeological record does not provide clear answers. What is evident is that human populations persisted and adapted to the changing landscape. New tool types emerged. Settlement patterns shifted. The early Holocene marked a transition toward more diversified subsistence strategies and increased regional differentiation. The retreat of continental ice sheets created new landscapes for human colonization. By 10,000 years ago, much of southern Canada was ice-free. Northern regions remained glaciated for several more millennia. Meltwater from retreating glaciers formed vast proglacial lakes. These lakes were larger and deeper than their modern counterparts. Glacial Lake Agassiz covered portions of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and extended into the northern United States. Its shorelines shifted repeatedly as ice margins fluctuated. Similar large lakes formed in other regions. The Great Lakes Basin underwent multiple transformations as drainage patterns changed and water levels rose and fell. Vegetation communities shifted northward as temperatures warmed. Tundra gave way to spruce forests. Spruce forests were gradually replaced by pine and mixed deciduous forests in southern areas. The boreal forest expanded across central Canada. Grasslands developed on the interior plains. These ecological transitions occurred over thousands of years. The pace varied by region and elevation. Animal populations tracked vegetation changes. Caribou moved north into tundra zones. Bison expanded onto the prairies. Moose, elk, and deer became more common in forested areas. Smaller mammals, birds, and fish colonized newly available habitats. Human populations expanded into these newly exposed territories. Archaeological sites become more numerous in the early Holocene. This increase may reflect actual population growth, better preservation, or both. Site distribution shows occupation of diverse environments. Lake shores, river valleys, and coastal zones were preferred locations. These areas offered concentrated resources and travel routes. Upland sites are less common but present. They likely represent hunting camps or lithic procurement locations. In the western interior, archaeological complexes emerge with distinct technological signatures. The Agate Basin complex appears on the northern plains around 10,000 years ago. It is characterized by lanceolate projectile points with careful flaking. Sites contain bison remains, indicating hunting of these animals as they expanded northward. The Hell Gap complex follows chronologically and shares similar point styles. These complexes represent continuity in plains adaptations. Bison hunting became increasingly important as megafauna disappeared. The Plano cultures occupied the prairies and parklands from approximately 10,000 to 7,000 years ago. Multiple point styles define subcomplexes within this broader tradition. Cody complex sites contain Eden and Scottsbluff points. Alberta complex sites feature lanceolate points with distinctive basal grinding. The Oxbow complex, dating to the later portion of this period, is marked by shouldered points. Researchers debate whether these represent distinct populations or stylistic variation within a continuous tradition. Site locations suggest seasonal movement between prairie grasslands and parkland edges. Winter camps may have been in sheltered river valleys. Summer aggregation sites occur near bison kill locations. Kill sites from this period are better preserved than earlier examples. The Fletcher site in Alberta contains the remains of multiple bison killed approximately 9,000 years ago. Bones show evidence of butchering. Stone tools were discarded after use. Similar sites exist throughout the plains. They indicate communal hunting strategies. Bison were driven into arroyos, pounds, or other natural traps. This required coordination among multiple family groups. It suggests seasonal aggregation and social cooperation. In the boreal forest zone, early Holocene sites reflect different adaptations. The Shield archaic tradition emerges around 8,000 years ago and persists for millennia. Sites are found across the Canadian Shield, from Labrador to the Northwest Territories. Toolkits include side-notched and corner-notched projectile points, scrapers, and knives. Copper tools appear in some assemblages, procured from native copper sources near Lake Superior. The metal was cold-hammered into points, knives, and awls. No evidence of smelting exists. Copper use represents one of the earliest instances of metalworking in North America. Subsistence in the boreal forest focused on caribou, moose, beaver, fish, and waterfowl. Plant foods included berries, roots, and seeds. Sites are small and scattered, indicating low population density and high mobility. Camps were occupied briefly, perhaps only days or weeks. Structures are rarely preserved, but post molds and hearth features suggest conical tents or similar portable shelters. Storage facilities are absent, consistent with a mobile lifeway. The Great Lakes region saw occupation intensify as water levels stabilized. Early sites cluster along ancient beach ridges and river mouths. The Park Hill complex, dating to around 10,000 years ago, is known from southern Ontario. It features fluted points and is associated with caribou hunting. As forests expanded, subsistence diversified. Later sites contain broader tool inventories and evidence of fishing. Net sinkers and fishhooks appear in assemblages after 9,000 years ago. On the Atlantic coast, early sites are rare due to sea level rise. The Desberts site, mentioned previously, represents the earliest well-documented occupation in Nova Scotia. Later sites from the early Holocene are scattered along interior river valleys. These sites contain bifurcate-based points and other tool forms distinct from interior traditions. Subsistence likely included fish, marine mammals, and terrestrial game. Preservation of organic remains is poor, limiting detailed reconstruction. The Pacific coast presents a different pattern. Sea levels were lower during the terminal Pleistocene and early Holocene. Many early sites are submerged on the continental shelf. Excavations on islands and at a few mainland locations have recovered early materials. The Namu site in British Columbia has occupation layers dating to approximately 10,000 years ago. Lower layers contain microblades and leaf-shaped points. Faunal remains include fish and sea mammals. This suggests early maritime adaptation, though the full extent is unknown due to submergence. Microblade technology is widespread in northern and western Canada during the early Holocene. Small blades were struck from prepared cores and likely hafted into composite tools. This technology is associated with Arctic and subarctic traditions and may indicate northern origins or connections. Sites with microblades occur in the Yukon, Northwest Territories, British Columbia, and Alberta. The distribution suggests population movement or technological diffusion across northern regions. Population estimates for the early Holocene remain speculative. Researchers suggest several thousand to perhaps tens of thousands of individuals across Canada. Regional densities varied significantly. Coastal and lakefront areas likely supported higher densities than interior forests or tundra. Groups were organized into small bands of a few dozen individuals. Seasonal aggregation for communal hunts or other activities brought bands together temporarily. Social organization was egalitarian. There is no archaeological evidence of hereditary leadership or wealth differentiation during this period. Trade networks existed but were limited in scale. Lithic raw materials moved across regions. Obsidian from volcanic sources in British Columbia appears at sites hundreds of kilometers away. Chert and other high-quality stone were transported from quarries to distant camps. Copper from Lake Superior sources reached sites in Ontario and beyond. These movements indicate contact between groups and exchange of valued materials. The mechanisms of exchange are unknown. Direct procurement, down-the-line trade, and seasonal gatherings are all possible explanations. Climate during the early Holocene was generally warmer than present. The Holocene thermal maximum, occurring between 9,000 and 5,000 years ago, brought higher temperatures to many regions. Tree lines advanced northward. Grasslands expanded on the plains. Some areas became drier. These environmental shifts influenced human settlement patterns and subsistence strategies. Regional responses varied based on local ecology and resource availability. Coastal environments along Canada's Pacific, Atlantic, and Arctic shorelines supported distinct subsistence economies. Archaeological evidence indicates that marine resources became increasingly important during the Holocene. The timing and intensity of maritime adaptation varied by region. Preservation issues complicate interpretation. Organic materials including bone, shell, and wood survive primarily in shell middens or waterlogged contexts. Acidic soils in many coastal areas destroy these remains. This creates an uneven archaeological record. The Pacific coast of British Columbia developed the most intensive maritime economies. The region's environmental productivity supported relatively dense populations. Salmon runs provided massive seasonal influxes of protein. 5 species of Pacific salmon spawn in coastal rivers and streams. Runs occurred at different times from spring through fall. This extended the fishing season. Groups positioned themselves along productive rivers to intercept migrating fish. Archaeological sites along major salmon rivers contain dense deposits of fire-cracked rock, charcoal, and tools associated with fish processing. Salmon were dried and smoked for winter storage. This allowed accumulation of surplus and supported longer-term settlement. Shell middens provide the best preserved evidence of coastal subsistence. These deposits contain accumulated shells, bone, tools, and other cultural materials. Middens begin appearing in the archaeological record around 10,000 years ago on the British Columbia coast. Early middens are small and scattered. Later middens become larger and represent longer or more intensive occupation. The Namu site contains midden deposits spanning thousands of years. Excavations reveal changes in shellfish exploitation, tool technology, and settlement intensity over time. Shellfish species exploited include clams, mussels, oysters, and other intertidal mollusks. These resources were available year-round and required minimal technology to harvest. They provided a reliable baseline food source. Nutritional analysis suggests shellfish alone could not support populations. They supplemented diets based on fish and terrestrial mammals. Marine mammals, including seals, sea lions, and porpoises, were hunted. Whale bones appear in some sites. It is unclear whether whales were actively hunted or scavenged when they beached. Both practices may have occurred. Technology associated with maritime economies includes harpoons, fishhooks, and net weights. Bone and antler were shaped into toggling harpoons designed to detach from the shaft and remain embedded in prey. Composite fishhooks combined bone or wood shanks with bone points. Net sinkers indicate use of nets for fishing. Groundstone tools, including adzes and chisels, were used for woodworking. Cedar and other woods were carved into planks, boxes, and canoes. Watercraft were essential for travel, fishing, and marine mammal hunting. Direct evidence of early canoes is rare due to preservation issues. Dugout canoe fragments have been recovered from waterlogged contexts at a few sites. Hide processing tools, including scrapers, fleshing tools, and bone beamers, were essential for preparing animal skins. Fresh hides were fleshed to remove tissue and fat. They were then dried, smoked, or tanned. Tanning required processing with brain tissue, liver, or other materials containing enzymes that prevented decomposition. Worked hides provided clothing, shelter covers, containers, and cordage. The labor investment in hide processing was substantial. Ethnographic accounts describe it as time-consuming work typically performed by women. Bone grease extraction was important in regions where large mammals were hunted. Bones were smashed and boiled to release marrow and grease. The grease floated to the surface and was skimmed off. It was stored in hide containers or mixed with dried meat to create pemmican. Archaeological evidence includes smashed bone fragments, fire-cracked rock from boiling, and specialized bone processing tools. The practice was particularly important on the plains, where bison provided raw materials. Regional technological traditions became increasingly distinct during the late prehistoric period. Coastal groups developed elaborate woodworking and bone-working technologies. Plains groups refined bison hunting implements and processing tools. Boreal forest populations maintained generalized toolkits suitable for diverse hunting and fishing. These regional patterns reflect long-term adaptations to local environments and resources. Exchange between regions continued, introducing new technologies and materials. However, core technological systems remained tied to regional ecological contexts. Climate fluctuations during the Holocene influenced resource distribution, settlement patterns, and population movements across Canada. The period following the Pleistocene was not climatically stable. Multiple warming and cooling phases occurred. These shifts altered vegetation zones, animal populations, water levels, and resource availability. Human populations adapted through technological innovation, subsistence changes, and territorial adjustments. The early Holocene, from approximately 11,000 to 8,000 years ago, was characterized by warming temperatures and retreating glaciers. Ice sheets continued melting, and landscapes previously covered by ice became available for colonization. Proglacial lakes drained or reconfigured as ice dams collapsed. Glacial Lake Agassiz underwent multiple drainage events, releasing massive volumes of water into ocean basins. These events may have temporarily disrupted ocean circulation patterns and regional climates. vegetation responded to warming by shifting northward and upward in elevation. Tundra was replaced by boreal forest in southern regions. Spruce dominated early forest compositions. Pine and deciduous species expanded later. Tree lines advanced into areas previously too cold for tree growth. The pace of vegetation change varied regionally. Western mountains saw rapid altitudinal shifts. Lowland areas experienced gradual transitions. Animal populations tracked vegetation changes. Caribou retreated northward as forests expanded. Moose and deer expanded their ranges into newly forested territories. The Holocene thermal maximum occurred between approximately 9,000 and 5,000 years ago. Temperatures during this interval were warmer than present in many regions. Some areas experienced temperatures 2 to 3 degrees Celsius above modern averages. Tree lines reached their northernmost extents. Glaciers in mountain regions retreated to minimal sizes. Prairie ecosystems expanded eastward into areas now occupied by forests. The Great Lakes region saw lower water levels as evaporation exceeded precipitation. On the northern plains, the altithermal period, roughly corresponding to the Holocene thermal maximum, brought drier conditions. Grasslands expanded. Bison populations likely fluctuated in response to forage availability. Archaeological sites from this period are relatively scarce on the plains. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of population decline or abandonment. Others suggest that site visibility is reduced due to erosion, burial, or changes in settlement patterns that produced less archaeologically visible sites. The debate remains unresolved. In the boreal forest, warmer temperatures extended growing seasons and may have increased biological productivity. However, evidence of human occupation during the thermal maximum shows continuity with earlier periods. Tool technologies remained similar. Settlement patterns continued emphasizing lake shores and river corridors. There is no clear evidence of population collapse or major subsistence shifts. This suggests populations successfully adapted to the warmer, drier conditions. Coastal regions experienced different climate impacts. On the Pacific coast, warmer temperatures affected salmon productivity through changes in ocean temperatures and stream flows. Optimal salmon spawning requires specific temperature ranges. Excessively warm water reduces oxygen levels and increases mortality. Archaeological evidence suggests coastal populations persisted and expanded during the thermal maximum. Shell midden accumulation rates increase, indicating sustained or growing populations. This suggests marine resources remained sufficiently productive despite climate changes. Sea level changes during the Holocene affected all coastal regions. Global sea levels rose from Pleistocene lows as ice sheets melted. The rate of rise varied over time, with rapid increases during early deglaciation and slower rises later. Local sea level changes resulted from interactions between eustatic rise and isostatic rebound. Areas that had been beneath thick ice sheets rebounded as the weight was removed. In some regions, rebound exceeded sea level rise, resulting in falling relative sea levels. In other areas, sea level rise dominated. The Atlantic coast experienced complex sea level histories. In the Gulf of St. Lawrence, rapid rebound initially outpaced sea level rise. Former seabeds emerged and were colonized by terrestrial vegetation. Archaeological sites dating to the early Holocene are now above sea level. Later, as rebound slowed and sea level rise continued, some coastal areas were submerged. In the Maritimes and Newfoundland, sea level rose relative to land, drowning coastal sites. This submergence destroyed or buried early coastal occupations. Lake level fluctuations affected interior populations. The Great Lakes underwent multiple low and high stands. During low stands, extensive beach ridges and coastal flats were exposed. These areas provided productive habitats and travel corridors. Archaeological sites cluster along ancient shorelines. When lake levels rose, these areas were inundated. Sites were buried under sediments or eroded by wave action. Reconstructing Great Lakes settlement patterns requires understanding past water levels and shoreline configurations. Neoglaciation began around 5,000 years ago. This cooling trend brought glacier re-advancement in mountain regions and cooler temperatures generally. Tree lines retreated downslope and southward. Growing seasons shortened. The impacts varied regionally. Arctic and subarctic regions experienced pronounced cooling. Southern regions saw more modest changes. Neoglaciation was not a single event, but a series of cooling and warming fluctuations. Multiple glacier advances and retreats occurred over the following millennia. The effects on human populations are visible archaeologically. In the Arctic, cooling temperatures may have reduced resource availability in some areas. The Dorset culture, which succeeded the Arctic small tool tradition around 2,500 years ago, showed technological adaptations to colder conditions. Dorset groups hunted seals through breathing holes in winter ice. This required sophisticated knowledge of seal behavior and ice conditions. Harpoon technology became more specialized. Houses became more substantial and better insulated. On the plains, bison populations increased during cooler, moister periods. Grassland productivity rose with increased precipitation. Bison hunting intensified correspondingly. The late prehistoric period on the plains, from approximately 2,000 years ago to contact, shows evidence of increased bison kill frequency and larger kill events. Pounds and jumps were used more intensively. Processing sites contain massive bone deposits indicating large-scale killing. In the boreal forest, caribou populations fluctuated with climate changes. Caribou range expanded southward during cooler periods and contracted northward during warming. Human populations adjusted their ranges and hunting strategies accordingly. Sites show shifts in location corresponding to changing caribou migration routes. Fishing remained important as a buffer against terrestrial resource variability. Drought episodes occurred periodically in interior regions. Evidence comes from lake-level records, vegetation changes, and archaeological site distributions. Droughts lasting decades or longer affected water availability, plant productivity, and animal populations. Human responses included increased mobility, territorial shifts, and subsistence diversification. In severe cases, regional abandonment may have occurred, though distinguishing abandonment from reduced site visibility is difficult. The Pacific Coast experienced El Niño Southern Oscillation effects, though understanding of prehistoric patterns is limited. El Niño events bring warmer ocean temperatures and altered precipitation patterns. These affect salmon runs, shellfish productivity, and terrestrial plant growth. Archaeological evidence of El Niño impacts is indirect. Variability in shell midden composition and site occupation intensity may reflect climate-driven resource fluctuations. Forest fire frequency varied with climate conditions. Drier periods saw increased fire activity. Fires created patchy landscapes with diverse successional stages. This increased habitat diversity and supported varied animal populations. Human populations may have used fire intentionally to manage landscapes. Ethnographic accounts describe deliberate burning to promote berry production, maintain travel corridors, and attract game. Archaeological evidence of intentional burning is difficult to distinguish from natural fires. Charcoal deposits are common, but their origins are often ambiguous. Volcanic eruptions introduced short-term climate perturbations. Major eruptions injected ash and sulfur compounds into the stratosphere, reducing solar radiation and cooling temperatures. The Mount Mazama eruption approximately 7,700 years ago deposited ash across western Canada and the northwestern United States. Sites buried by ash provide precise temporal markers. Population responses to such events are unclear. Short-term disruptions likely occurred, but long-term adaptations are not evident archaeologically. Climate changes affected different resources in different ways. Terrestrial plants responded relatively quickly to temperature and moisture changes. Animal populations adjusted over years or decades. Fish populations reflected changes in stream flows and temperatures. Marine resources were influenced by ocean circulation patterns. The combination of these factors created complex environmental mosaics. Human populations occupying broad territories could buffer against localized resource failures by moving or shifting subsistence emphasis. Regional differentiation in climate impacts meant that populations experienced different selection pressures. Arctic populations faced intensifying cold and ice. Coastal populations dealt with changing marine productivity. Plains populations responded to shifting bison ranges. Boreal forest groups adapted to fluctuating caribou and moose populations. These varying conditions contributed to technological and social divergence between regions. Cultural traditions became increasingly distinct during the late Holocene, reflecting long-term adaptations to regional climates. Population resilience to climate change varied with subsistence strategies. Groups relying on diverse resources were more buffered against failures of individual species. Specialized economies were more vulnerable to climate-driven resource declines, but potentially more productive during optimal conditions. Mobility provided flexibility to track shifting resources. Storage and sedentism allowed populations to remain in productive areas despite seasonal or annual variability. Different combinations of these strategies emerged in different regions. Regional differentiation became increasingly pronounced during the Middle and Late Holocene. Distinct cultural traditions emerged reflecting adaptations to local environments, available resources, and varying degrees of sedentism. Archaeological complexes defined by tool types, settlement patterns, and subsistence practices characterized different regions. These traditions persisted for centuries or millennia, indicating stable adaptations and cultural continuity. The Pacific Coast developed the most complex regional traditions. By 3,000 years ago, clear patterns of sedentism, storage economies, and social differentiation emerged. The Gulf of Georgia region, encompassing the southern British Columbia coast and adjacent islands, shows particularly intensive occupation. Large plank house villages appeared along productive shorelines. Some villages contained dozens of houses and may have supported populations of several hundred individuals. House construction required coordinated labor and substantial time investment. Posts and beams were felled, transported, and erected. Planks were split from cedar logs and fitted to frames. These structures represent significant capital investment and suggest long-term occupation. Storage features became common in coastal villages. Wooden boxes and baskets held dried fish, fish oil, and other preserved foods. Underground pits lined with cedar bark stored roots and other materials. The scale of storage indicates surplus production beyond immediate consumption needs. Surplus allowed populations to remain in villages year-round and supported non-food producing activities, including craft specialization and ceremonial events. Social stratification appears in the archaeological record through differential burial treatment and house sizes. Some burials contain elaborate grave goods, including copper ornaments, dentalium shell beads, and groundstone sculptures. Other burials have minimal or no associated goods. House sizes vary within villages, with some structures significantly larger than others. These patterns suggest status differentiation and possibly hereditary ranking. Documentary evidence from the contact period describes ranked societies with chiefs, commoners, and slaves. The archaeological record indicates these patterns developed over millennia. The Marpole phase, dating from approximately 2,400 to 1,000 years ago, represents a well-documented period on the southern coast. Sites contain evidence of specialized fishing, woodworking, and bone carving. Ground stone sculptures depicting human and animal forms appear. These objects may have served ceremonial functions. Labrets, ornaments worn in piercings below the lower lip, are found in burials. They indicate body modification practices and possibly status markers. Trade networks expanded during the late prehistoric period on the coast. Obsidian from interior sources reached coastal villages. Dentalium shell from Vancouver Island was traded northward and into the interior. Copper from native sources was worked into ornaments and tools. The Tlingit region of southeast Alaska traded with coastal British Columbia groups. Exchange included prestige goods, raw materials, and possibly foodstuffs. Warfare or conflict appears in the archaeological record through fortified village sites and skeletal trauma. Some late prehistoric villages were located on defensible headlands or islands. Palisades constructed from posts surrounded certain villages. Human remains show evidence of projectile wounds and blunt force trauma. Mass burials at some sites contain individuals with trauma patterns consistent with violent death. The frequency and scale of conflict varied regionally and temporally. Coastal populations may have competed over productive fishing locations and trade routes. In the interior plateau region of British Columbia, different patterns emerged. The plateau extends from the Fraser River eastward to the Rocky Mountains and north into central British Columbia. The environment is drier than the coast with grasslands and open forests. Salmon runs in plateau rivers supported substantial populations. The Fraser River and its tributaries hosted massive salmon migrations. Groups positioned winter villages along productive stretches. Unlike coastal groups, plateau populations remained more mobile, moving between winter villages and seasonal camps. Pitehouse villages are characteristic of the plateau region. Pitehouses were semi-subterranean structures excavated 1 to 2 meters into the ground. Roofs were supported by posts and beams and covered with earth. This provided insulation against cold winters. House sizes varied from small single-family dwellings to large structures exceeding 10 meters in diameter. Large houses may have accommodated extended families or multiple families. Villages contained from a few to over 100 pit houses. The construction sequence of pit houses is visible archaeologically. Early pit houses were relatively small and shallow. Over time, sizes increased and depths grew. By the late prehistoric period, some pit houses exceeded 15 meters in diameter and 3 meters in depth. The labor required for construction increased correspondingly. This suggests population growth and increased sedentism. Some pit house villages were occupied for centuries, with houses being rebuilt multiple times on the same locations. Subsistence on the plateau focused on salmon, deer, roots, and berries. Salmon were taken during spawning runs and dried for winter storage. Deer were hunted year-round, but especially during fall. Roots, including camas, bitterroot, and others were dug in spring and early summer. These were cooked in earth ovens and dried for storage. Berries were collected in summer and dried. The combination of fish, game, and plant foods provided a diverse diet. Processing technology included earth ovens for cooking roots, drying racks for fish and meat, and storage pits. Earth ovens were pits lined with stones. Fires heated the stones, then food wrapped in vegetation was placed in the pit and covered with earth. Cooking took hours or overnight. This method was effective for processing large quantities of roots. Archaeologically, earth ovens appear as concentrations of fire-cracked rock. These features are abundant at plateau sites. Trade connected plateau groups to coastal and plains populations. Obsidian from plateau sources moved in all directions. Marine shell from the coast appeared in plateau sites. Bison hides from the plains were traded westward. The plateau occupied a geographic position facilitating exchange between ecological zones. Groups controlled access to key river crossings and trade routes. This may have contributed to accumulation of wealth and status differentiation. On the northern plains, bison hunting intensified during the late prehistoric period. The Avonlea complex, dating from approximately 1,700 to 1,000 years ago, introduced bow and arrow technology to the region. Avonlea points are small, delicately flaked, and side-notched. They represent a significant shift from larger dart points used with atlatls. The bow and arrow increased hunting efficiency and range. This may have contributed to increased bison kill frequencies. The Old Women's Phase succeeded Avonlea around 1,000 years ago and persisted until contact. Old Women's Phase sites contain small side-notched and triangular points. Bison remains dominant faunal assemblages. Pounds and jumps continued as primary kill methods. Some kill sites contain remains of hundreds of bison, indicating large communal hunts. Processing sites show evidence of bone grease extraction, hide processing, and meat drying. Pottery appeared on the northern plains during the Old Women's Phase. Vessels were small and simply decorated. The technology likely diffused from woodland groups to the east. Pottery adoption was incomplete, with many sites lacking ceramics entirely. This suggests it supplemented rather than replaced existing container technologies. Teepee rings are abundant on the plains landscape. These stone circles held down tipi covers and remain after organic materials decomposed. Ring diameters provide estimates of tipi sizes. Most range from 4 to 6 meters, suitable for single families. Arrangements of multiple rings indicate camps. Some sites contain dozens or hundreds of rings, representing repeated occupations or large gatherings. The distribution of teepee rings reflects settlement patterns and territorial use. Medicine wheels and stone alignments appear at certain plains locations. These features consist of central cairns with radiating stone lines and surrounding circles. The Majorville medicine wheel in Alberta has been dated to over 4,000 years ago, with evidence of continued use into the late prehistoric period. Functions are debated. Astronomical observations, ceremonial activities, and territorial markers have been proposed. Ethnographic accounts link medicine wheels to religious and ceremonial practices. In the boreal forest and Canadian Shield, the laurel culture was succeeded by the black duck culture around 1,200 years ago in the western regions. Black duck pottery differs from laurel in decoration and vessel form. Black duck vessels have castellations, projections along the rim, and different stamping patterns. The culture extended from Manitoba to northwestern Ontario. Subsistence continued focusing on fish, caribou, moose, and wild rice where available. Wild rice harvesting became important in areas where it grew naturally. The grain was collected from canoes, dried, and processed by parching and threshing. The Selkirk culture emerged around 1,000 years ago and is associated with Cree expansion. Selkirk pottery is fabric-impressed and thin-walled. The culture spread across the boreal forest from Hudson Bay westward. Sites are located along rivers and lake shores. Fish weirs and caribou drives provided subsistence. The expansion of Selkirk culture may reflect population growth and territorial displacement of earlier groups. In eastern Canada, the Point Peninsula culture developed in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence regions between 2,500 and 1,000 years ago. Pottery manufacture was well established. Burial mounds contained multiple interments with grave goods. Long-distance trade brought exotic materials, including marine shell, native copper, and galena. The culture shows connections to Hopewellian traditions in the Ohio Valley, though the nature of these connections is debated. The Princess Point complex emerged in southern Ontario around 1,300 years ago. It marks a transition toward increasing reliance on cultivated plants. Corn, beans, and squash appear in archaeological contexts. Cultivation was initially supplementary to hunting, fishing, and gathering. Over time, Agriculture intensified. The late woodland period, from approximately 1,000 years ago to contact, saw expansion of maize agriculture and population growth. Iroquoian cultures developed in the lower Great Lakes region during the late woodland period. Villages became larger and increasingly fortified. Palisades surrounded many settlements. Longhouses, rectangular structures up to 30 meters long, housed multiple families. Villages contained dozens of longhouses and supported populations of several hundred to over 1,000 individuals. Corn agriculture provided the subsistence base. Fields surrounded villages and were cultivated using digging sticks and hoes. On the Atlantic coast, the woodland period saw a continuation of mixed hunting, fishing, and gathering economies. Coastal sites contain shell middens with fish, seal, and shellfish remains. Pottery appears around 2,500 years ago. Vessels were cord-marked or fabric-impressed. Settlement remained relatively mobile with seasonal movements between coastal and interior locations. Population densities were lower than in the Great Lakes agricultural regions. The Arctic saw the replacement of Dorset culture by Thule culture around 1,000 years ago. Thule culture originated in Alaska and spread rapidly eastward across the Canadian Arctic. Thule groups were specialized whale hunters. They used large skin boats called umiaks to hunt bowhead whales in open water. Whale bones were used in house construction. Thule winter houses were semi-subterranean with whalebone or driftwood frames covered with sod. The expansion of Thule culture coincided with the medieval warm period, which reduced sea ice and increased whale accessibility. Thule technology included sophisticated harpoons, float gear, and boats. Dog sleds facilitated winter travel and hunting. Bow and arrow technology was used for caribou hunting. The toolkit was diverse and specialized for Arctic conditions. Thule culture represents the ancestors of modern Inuit populations. The archaeological record shows clear continuity from prehistoric Thule to historic Inuit material culture. Regional differentiation by the late prehistoric period created a mosaic of distinct cultural traditions across Canada. Coastal groups developed sedentism and social complexity. Plains groups intensified bison hunting. Boreal forest populations maintained mobile hunting and fishing economies. Agricultural groups emerged in the Great Lakes. Arctic populations specialized in marine mammal hunting. These patterns reflect millennia of adaptation to regional environments and represent the cultural diversity present at European contact. Archaeological evidence for social complexity varies across Canadian regions. Complexity encompasses multiple dimensions, including settlement permanence, population aggregation, status differentiation, specialized labor, and conflict. The degree of complexity achieved in prehistoric Canada was generally lower than in some other North American regions, but certain areas developed clear social hierarchies and organizational structures. Burial practices provide insight into social organization. Differential treatment of the dead suggests status distinctions. On the Pacific coast, burials dating to the late prehistoric period show variation in grave goods and burial location. Some individuals were interred with elaborate ornaments, including copper bracelets, dentalium shell necklaces, and groundstone sculptures. Others received minimal goods or none. Infants and children occasionally received rich grave assemblages, suggesting ascribed rather than achieved status. This indicates hereditary ranking where status was determined by birth rather than individual accomplishment. The Port au Choix site in Newfoundland contains burials from the maritime archaic tradition dating to approximately 4,000 years ago. Over 100 individuals were recovered. Grave goods included ground slate points, bone harpoons, toggling harpoons, antler foreshafts, and personal ornaments. Red ochre was liberally applied to bodies and grave goods. The quantity of goods suggests these individuals held status within their communities. Whether status was hereditary or achieved cannot be determined definitively from burial evidence alone. Burial mounds in the Great Lakes region indicate organized labor and possibly social stratification. The construction of earthen mounds required coordinated effort by multiple individuals. Mounds contain single or multiple burials. Grave goods in some mounds include exotic materials that traveled hundreds or thousands of kilometers. Marine shell from the Gulf of Mexico, native copper from Lake Superior, and obsidian from Western sources appear together in burial contexts. The accumulation of such materials suggests some individuals or groups controlled exchange networks or held positions allowing acquisition of rare goods. Evidence of violence appears across multiple regions and time periods. Skeletal trauma consistent with interpersonal violence includes projectile wounds, blunt force injuries, and sharp force cuts. Some individuals show healed injuries indicating survival of violent encounters. Others show perimortem trauma indicating death from violence. Mass burials containing individuals with similar trauma patterns suggest conflict events involving multiple casualties. Fortified villages provide architectural evidence of conflict concern. On the Pacific coast, some late prehistoric villages occupied defensible locations on steep slopes or offshore islands. Palisades constructed from posts surrounded certain villages. The effort required to build and maintain defensive works suggests persistent threat perception. Whether actual warfare was frequent or rare cannot be determined from fortifications alone, but their presence indicates conflict was a significant concern. Iroquoian villages in southern Ontario were extensively fortified during the late woodland period. Triple palisades surrounded some villages. Bastions projected from palisade lines to provide defensive firing positions. Villages were relocated periodically, possibly due to soil exhaustion from agriculture, but also potentially to escape conflict. The scale of fortifications increased over time, suggesting escalating conflict intensity. Weaponry evolution reflects both hunting needs and interpersonal violence. Projectile points effective against game animals also served as weapons against humans. The adoption of bow and arrow technology around 1,700 years ago increased the lethality of interpersonal violence. Bows had greater range and accuracy than atlatls. Arrows could be shot rapidly. These characteristics made bows effective weapons in conflict. Defensive armor appears in some contexts. On the Pacific coast, ethnographic accounts describe wooden slat armor and hide armor worn during warfare. Archaeological recovery of such items is rare due to organic preservation issues. However, some carved representations depict armored figures. Helmets carved from wood have been recovered from wet sites. These items indicate preparation for and engagement in organized violence. Slavery is documented ethno-historically on the Pacific coast. Coastal groups raided neighboring communities to capture individuals who became slaves. Slaves performed labor and served as status symbols for owners. Archaeological evidence of slavery is difficult to identify definitively. However, some burial patterns suggest differential treatment consistent with slave status. Individuals buried in marginal locations without grave goods may represent low-status individuals, including possible slaves. Exchange networks facilitated the movement of materials and possibly ideas across vast distances. Shell beads manufactured on the Pacific coast reached the plains and boreal forest. Obsidian from sources in British Columbia, Wyoming, and Oregon moved hundreds of kilometers. Copper from Lake Superior appeared in sites from the Atlantic to the plains. These distributions indicate contact between distant groups. Dentalium shell from Vancouver Island served as a medium of exchange and status marker. The shells are tubular mollusks harvested from offshore waters. They were graded by size and strung on cords. Longer shells were more valuable. Ethnographic accounts describe dentalium functioning as currency in transactions and as bride wealth in marriages. Archaeological distribution shows movement of dentalium throughout the Pacific Northwest and into interior regions. Marine shell beads from the Pacific and Atlantic coasts moved inland through exchange. The labor required to manufacture beads was substantial. Shells were drilled using stone tools. This required time and skill. Finished beads represented significant invested labor. Their value reflected manufacturing costs and rarity in inland contexts. Beads functioned as wealth items and status markers.